All right. I'm Chris Mott, and I'm with Global Venture Advisors. And the session I'm going to present to you now is around remote sales, market discovery, and smart ops for AI Advantage. Great. So the coverage we'll have here, we're going to talk about remote growth during the pandemic. We'll provide some example use cases, Europe to US expansion, US to Europe, and then intra-European, primarily around B2B. We'll share 9 ways to grow smarter this year, and then we'll go into using AI and trying to create competitive advantage in doing so. I'm Chris Mott. We've been doing market growth for about 10 years with primarily European companies, but as well some US and Japanese. We focus mainly on that growth moment. We call it growth 2.0, when companies are trying to get their second wind and have proven out their regional markets, maybe have a few international clients, but really want to make it more robust. The fact is that leaders that want to change the world all share the same challenge, which is that scaling is hard. I remember when I was working at a startup and I was there about 9 years. It was a fantastic experience. Didn't feel like this, actually. It felt more like climbing a wall of ice vertically. And a couple of years in, looking up and looking down and really being nervous about slipping and just feeling like it was a ton of work. Today, things have changed. I hesitate a little bit using this photo because I don't think it's completely representative of what's going on. But if for anyone that's seen the new Netflix series, 14 Peaks, where they scaled 14 8,000 meter peaks in 7 months, you'll kind of get the feeling of what I mean. I think there, and that there are better ways to grow. We need to go find those ways to grow. And today we're going to share some thoughts on what those could be. In summary, using small teams, testing, codifying, leveraging affinity networks, thinking in bets, both for your growth strategy and for your AI strategy, and really trying to build out a niche advantage as you build out your foundation for growth. Where did this all start? Well, actually, we've had the good fortune of teaming up with Tech Tour and the team here beginning in 2013 when we started doing these growth insight sessions. And I remember in 2015, we had Shardul Shah from Index, and he probably would cringe knowing that I'm including him in a presentation 6 years later. But I remember he said something that really struck me at the time, and it was that you need to get traction from day one. There's all sorts of other advice we've heard, lots of insights and so forth, but that's the one that has always stuck with me. And trying to figure out how it is that you answer that question actually is interesting, because this last year in September, Index came out with an ebook. Probably folks on the call, a lot of you guys know about this, but it's called US Expansion, and it came out last September, so a little over a year ago. And I love this document because actually I think it answers his question of how you need to get traction from day one. I think they do a fantastic job, and I won't drill too far into it, but I do want to give you a little sense of the formula that they've got, which is that there are essentially 2 variables or 2 continuums that you need to consider as you're looking at what to do as, particularly in this case, a European startup that's wanting to expand in the US. One has to do with how large your total addressable market is. The other is boots on the ground and how important they are to make that work. So as you look at this quadrant thing here, over to the right focuses on the percentage of the total addressable market that remote market, in this case, the US, represents. And if you're in a compass scenario, you're looking at the US or that remote market being more than 50% of your total addressable market. It's super important. You need to get product market fit early. Founders may need to move there, and so forth. That's when you've got a high boots on the ground requirement. That's one angle. The other one is the boots on the ground. So we look at the lower percentage TAM with the home anchor, where it's like 15 to 30%, still significant. So you want to be there, but it requires Europe, or the other market is much more central, and it requires lots of people to be on the ground, like logistics businesses, or physical infrastructure scenarios, like maybe more of an IoT scenario or advanced manufacturing. Pendulum and home anchor are two categories that they view there. And pendulum is when you really could have your HQ in either that remote market or your home market, say the US and Europe. You've got a bit more TAM there, 30 to 50%. But you can read this study yourself. I just wanted to give a really quick snapshot of it. And what I think is really interesting is that here we are during the pandemic, and we're all trying to figure out how to grow our businesses. And the fact is, this is kind of the unique thing about where our consultancy focuses is around this growth two moment, where you're really looking at how you can achieve higher shareholder value and capture the market opportunity that you have in front of you. And in fact, this blue box is really that challenging moment, again, where you're trying to get your second wind as a business. You believe that you can, maybe you've got some international customers or some US customers, but you haven't completely gone for it. And you need to figure out how to do that. So our point of view is that regardless of which of these archetypes you're in, telescope, which is sort of, as it describes, looking at the market from a distance, or compass, where it's the remote market is a huge market for you and you need to be there. It's got to be part of your compass from the very early stages of the business. And then this idea of either a pendulum or a anchor. These are the other couple there. But this case was one where it was an IoT company out of Berlin. They were edge. They also loved their soldering irons and their metals shop in the office, as well as hiring a gaming guy that had cloud experience. So they had this real wide-ranging skill set. And they believed that it was important that they were engaging with some of the major players in the market. So they remotely began to target, they identified 25 companies that they felt were on their short list that they needed to be partners with in order to be successful in their market. They really focused in on the OEM and channels. So yeah, there was some direct activity, but mainly they were trying to get their mojo via an OEM partnership where one of these guys would bake their solution into their solution and help bring it to market. In the end, they were successful in doing it that way. It wasn't until they'd landed Cisco as an OEM deal and they'd gotten Intel and Dell as additional partners based on all of that heavy lifting that they'd done getting through the qualifications with Cisco. And once they'd achieved that, and they began working actually through the partner network of Cisco, the CEO and the solution architect lead both decided to move themselves over to California. The second example, NLP, so natural language technology. This is a case where the market was probably not quite as big in the US. They'd had tons of success with industry in Europe. Granted, the deals may take longer at times and so forth, but still it's a tremendous market back home in Europe. But they did want to begin engaging the US market in the similar verticals. And they started with just 5 targets, actually, really super flagship types, and leveraging affinity networks to go in there. Actually, we leveraged some of the alumni from my grad program. And they targeted 3 verticals, so not 1, but 3. And the reason for that is really being able to figure out where your sweet spot is going to be, and not putting all your eggs in one basket there. So it was outbound via LinkedIn, a lot of online content related things and affinity networks, and then landing those 2 deals. And in fact, when they were acquired, the interesting thing for me that I thought was that a lot of the practices, the tools that were being developed, the ways of having team cooperation between, say, marketing, pre-sales, solutions, and say SDRs was tremendous, and that became an anchor for a horizontal function, business development function, when they were acquired by a unicorn, which we stuck around there actually for about a year, and I was really surprised to see how some of these basic approaches for international growth really were leverageable once they got into this larger organization and had to help that larger company squeeze the value out of the acquisition and help the business. Lots of other examples. So Europe to US open source examples where they're heavy on the inbound. Open source allows for a lot of self-service, and you can still do quite large enterprise deals, but they did not open their US offices until they achieved some major client wins. And then US into Europe, which given GDPR, Brexit, the pandemic, a whole bunch of reasons why European industry should be interesting for non-European tech firms. But of course, you've got this fragmentation, slower decisions in Europe. So, you need to go through an extra layer of deciding which of the regional geography clusters you're going to focus on. And I'm not going to go into that much here, but anyone that has worked in Europe understands what I'm talking about there. And I think another really interesting one is this question of intra-European growth. And I think, again, given these sort of meta trends we've seen the last few years, there's just more activity going on between geographies. I've seen a lot of it between Central Europe and Northwestern Europe, and a lot more interest or sort of curiosity in the UK-Europe combination. And then, of course, the US trying to figure out, can they continue using the UK as their anchor as they go to market across Europe? And I think the reality is, I think you really do need to be somewhere on the continent now. So again, a bunch of interesting things to think about how you might grow next year. I'm not going to provide too much commentary on these other slides here, these in a nutshell slides, but they provide more background on the small team philosophy, the segmentation, the idea of hitting multiple peaks or segments as you achieve this kind of, you could imagine this slide being three-dimensional and these circles being mountains, I guess, is how I think about it. The purple things on the process diagram there really are part of that creative small team dynamic of discovery and seeing something, analyzing what works, what doesn't, adjusting, all of that type of stuff can be done remotely. And then again, across the top there are lots of other channels which can begin to leverage the insights that you've learned by doing the strategic outbound and beginning to codify it for a more scalable business approach. So there's tons of assets that you're going to identify. Any B2B pre-sales or sales guy or head of BD or chief revenue officer is going to be super conscious of the fact that if they go international early, they're kind of managing two startups. If they're going late, then they've got a very mature operation with their primary business, but they've got to have a kind of a startup mentality in their international remote growth approach. But if they can manage to do that, then there's a bunch of insights that they can grab around their true product positioning. They can synthesize that a bit between their 2 or 3 markets to be sure that the way they articulate things and the way they manage their content roadmap makes sense. And then also they're baking in the right things for their inbound campaigns and measuring the right things and ultimately hiring people and developing them in the right ways. Differentiation, it really boils down to having this content roadmap and knowing over time, how can we tackle the business gain or logic or fear, whatever those particular angles are, but those have been based on the insights that you've gathered. And again, this idea of mastering remote sales, you can skip steps, you can get senior people on the call, you can help drive decisions earlier. That said, if your story is not articulating things better than the customer themselves can articulate them in terms of their needs, you're going to struggle. And even being 2 degrees off in your messaging or not acknowledging that there may be something that you need to validate versus push can really create some friction in the sales process. Finally, there's this sort of idea of exploring, operationalizing, and then doing a true no-go on expansion. But the good news is that during COVID, we certainly can do a lot of this assessment activity remotely. So again, this telescope idea that Index came out with as one of 4 archetypes really is applicable to all scenarios where the market is at least 15% of your future market and where you want to assess the market before you throw all your eggs into that market, or half your eggs into that market. So hope that that provides a little bit of perspective when we talk about growth approach, what the method to the madness can be like. And if you're a CEO or CXO of any kind, founder of any kind, wondering how are you going to the next 12 months assess and get your act together as far as expanding on the revenues you've got, those are some useful tips. So the second piece of this is getting competitive advantage with artificial intelligence. So thinking like people, basically simplifying work, making functions easier to do. And machine learning is a practical way of achieving AI because it's very clear, especially for natural language processing or for vision AI. And microservices, the theme that we heard earlier from SAP and a couple of our AI companies, Algolytics and Gravity R&D, provided, I think, a really good perspective on how enterprises are using microservices more and more. Now, between 2015 and 2018 or something, I think that the big 8 tech companies around the world, I think they acquired 30, 40 AI companies. So, some companies acquire the capability into them, but most of us are not aren't able to do things at that volume. And the bottom line is the compounding growth those companies have seen the last couple of years, and look at their market caps. There's just no question that underlying engine of analysis and decision making is helping them. So how do we do that as smaller companies? We know that machine learning is not a new thing, but we also have seen that compute is becoming much cheaper, and that if it's true that 80% of the enterprise data out there is still underutilized, and that companies are beginning to evaluate that and do that more, there's just no question that there's a competitive advantage waiting for each company to figure out. Now, is that a product advantage where you actually bake some things into your technology, or is it a tools advantage where you're using it to grow and it's just part of your business architecture? Those are the kinds of questions that I would be super focused on, because at the end of the analysis, we can see that all the major tech platforms out there, the cloud providers that we all know, and also the dozens, if not hundreds, of machine learning platforms out there are getting better and better at answering the questions that we have and helping us make the tough decisions. So, this is just a screenshot that I pulled from an Azure ML presentation from literally like 3-4 years ago. I mean, this is not new stuff. And the fact is that the idea of taking particular algorithms, parameters, and features and mashing them together and figuring out for this particular problem, what's the most likely outcome that I'm going to have. So this is coming. Now, of course, practical terms from a tech company, a tech firm point of view, or say a 200-person company, 50-person company, trying to figure out how to manage their international operations, I view it as sort of starting at the base there, stage 1, where it's really about the people. Where are you putting the people? Your commercial guys are going to be perhaps remote. Your R&D may stay local. This idea of market discovery, does it happen out of your existing team, or do you protect them and you use sort of a bolt-on to go out and discover some of this stuff so they can stay consistent, but you still get those learnings? Those basic questions about sort of placement and responsibilities, you got to start there because that's the team you're working with. On top of that, then stage 2, it's all the stuff we've all been using for a long time, actually. LinkedIn, video analytics, SEO, CRM, all of these have some element of data management, and most of them have machine learning going on. As you get into stage 3, you start needing to think about ML engineering. So creating a niche advantage that's unique. So something that is you can depend on, that you can do better. And I'll provide some examples of that in a moment. So insight, automation as kind of those 2 outcomes we look for when we're leveraging smart technologies. So this is just, I think I just threw this together actually just to show a little bit of a hierarchy of maturity there. So Great example of AI in play. So GDPR compliant lead gen. If you are an American company looking at getting into Europe or selling into European citizens in the States, or you're just a company out of Europe that wants to be sure that whatever you do, you're covered, then this concept of meeting the GDPR requirements, but also helping to automate a bit, given the challenges that people face doing inside sales these days and the decrease in performance. So AI is coming in and both providing a compliance and a productivity. And James, who spoke actually back in March, made the point, this is from his presentation actually, that it took him 3 years to build out their capability. And this shows you there's a ton of different things that they tried to pull together in order to provide what they do now, which is GDPR compliant lead gen. So the fact of the investment of time and effort and vision is something which creates a brick of value. And each of those bricks need to be assessed proactively as a company continues to grow, especially as they begin to get their understanding not of their regional market, but of their global market, and what tactics are going to use to reach those clients. So marketing and care, there are a boatload of applications, and even when you're doing SEO these days, there can be AI behind it that's helping to make sense of it for you. And as you build out your headers or your copy, or try to automate some of your customer care, we all know that there's more and more things you can use. Again, the idea of performance in managing teams, I really like the Gong application, and I'm sure most people know about them. These guys are absolutely on fire as a company, and they make some great points around what are best practices for teams, what do best performing salespeople do, when do they do it, and they can do comparatives against lower performers. And in the end, they say, we want to look at each person, and we understand each person has strengths and weaknesses. If we can fill out their weaknesses, then we've just created a super strong sales force. So how to scale more easily? Well, there are 3 particular services that we do that are each options as companies are looking at this stuff. The first is market dev discovery. These are 6-month projects, between 4 and 6 months. Landing teams, this is what happens typically after you've done this market dev discovery and you're actually blowing out your teams or your partnership capabilities, your battle cards, your growth playbooks, your inbound benchmarking and approaches, all of those things that you need to blow the doors off of growth. And then the last thing is these deep tech summits. So we had a couple of clients presenting in the session, and this is something that is a great way for companies to build out some evergreen content that they can use over time. So again, today really just wanted to provide some background on where things are during the pandemic from a Europe to US perspective, with some additional context from the other direction, as well as intra-Europe, that those are all things that companies are having to think about, and that the Index Ventures a year ago ebook is a great place to start. It provides, I think on their website, they also have some ways of self-assessing, although it's pretty obvious when you read this thing, kind of how to do that for yourself. And wanted to provide some very practical sort of 2 drill down or 3 drill down levels underneath those strategies, and point out the fact that in fact, the telescope approach where you're looking at a market remotely is very well suited to any of the other strategies. And if you're looking to get traction on day one, that it's a great approach to start with. And then it also leads to understanding what that growth tech stack should look like and how you can use AI. Historically, I was very product centric and as a product manager, and the last, say, few years more oriented around growth. But it's really obvious that company architectures are now a part of the sort of the mandate. It's no longer Well, it's really never been about who has the best mousetrap. So thank you again for today. Really appreciate being able to present as part of Tech Tour's Deep Tech program. If you have any questions about how to leverage that community better, please reach out to me. Or if you'd like to talk and brainstorm or share your thoughts on how you went to market across Atlantic or how you're thinking about doing it, feel free to give me a call. I love talking about this stuff, and certainly would appreciate or enjoy brainstorming with you. Thank you again, and have a nice rest of your day.